morning.
Hope you guys have been doing well. Hope you guys have been thriving. Today, we find ourselves by some rails that we haven't visited in a minute. The CSX at Abbeville subdivision, a line that doesn't see the most trains, but definitely provides some quality over quantity type action for performers like myself to enjoy. And today would be one of those days where we would find quality out on the rails, because we are currently in Lawrenceville, Georgia, next to the old Lawrenceville train depot, waiting for CSX M583 with CSX 1850, the LNN Heritage Unit leading. A unit that I fortunately got to see when it was very fresh out of the Waycross paint shops.
Nice.
But even now, it still has a nice horn, has a pretty cool paint scheme, and I was here with a bunch of friends, and I just wanted to see it again and chill with the gang. I was rushing over here because I was fairly certain that I was gonna miss this train, but fortunately, I would find my friends, a clear signal, and a beautiful sunset to provide a very nice scene for this manifest to roll through. And fortunately for me, very conveniently, I wouldn't even have to wait 10 minutes before we started hearing a deep rumble off in the distance, and the headlights of M583 snaked around the curve off in the distance. If you watch this channel regularly, you know that I am no stranger to chases, and today I would be doing yet another one. Because right after the Hand Power cleared, me and a couple of the guys I was with here decided to dip from this spot to try to find another location where we could see the LNN Heritage Unit before nightfall set in, passing through downtown Lawrenceville, Georgia and its busy shopping district, before eventually finding ourselves in Decula, Georgia, where the slow speed of M583 through Lawrenceville gave us just enough time for us to barely beat it here, as within 5 minutes of our arrival, the rails would promptly get lit by the lights of 1850 leading this manifest up towards North Carolina. Now for the layman, the average Joe who's just seeing a train running by, you may be familiar with the railroad CSX, but you may be confused on that first unit scheme.
What is this?
Perhaps you're wondering, why is the majority of the locomotive painted a different scheme? And why isn't the cab painted?
Wait a minute!
Well, to avoid a firestorm, I'm just going to answer the former. This locomotive is painted in the L&N scheme because this locomotive is a heritage unit.
What is that?
Now, for those of you who aren't aware, the major railroads that exist today did not just pop up out of the blue. They're the result of a lot of mergers from many different railroads spanning all across the United States that, due to different political or business or socioeconomic reasons, found themselves merging together to eventually form the main railroad giants that we see today. And when one of these railroad giants paints a locomotive in a scheme that matches one of its predecessor railroads, you have a heritage unit. A unit that is basically highlighting the heritage of the current railroad by bearing the scheme of the predecessor railroad. CSX 1850 here bearing the marking L and N to signify the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, and a railroad that is technically foreign to this area. The rails that this train is running on right now is not L&N trackage. In fact, for this scheme to have really been on home rails, it would have to have been running where we first saw it on the CSX WNA subdivision. And seeing a scheme that is historically pretty foreign to this area had me thinking how all these different railroads came together. CSX has scheduled 21 heritage units to be released, and each one of these heritage units marks a different railroad that somehow contributed to the creation of CSX. And I know that us foamers just like seeing new paint schemes and the hype of a heritage unit leading a train, but have you guys ever wondered what these schemes actually mean?
Nope.
Like historically, what these different railroads meant and how they actually led to CSX?
Nope.
Well, I did. So just because I saw this one unit, I went through the grueling process of researching all the major railroads, all the major mergers, and some of the key socioeconomic factors that led to the creation of CSX.
I can't believe you've done this.
Now, if you want to just do a quick Google search, trains.com does actually have a map that has all the parts of the CSX trackage labeled with the respective predecessor railroads. And there are a lot of different railroads that led to the CSX that we know. However, there is some missing information in this map. For instance, do y'all see Conrail on this map?
No.
Exactly. There are certain key mergers and corporate alliances that can't be captured on a single image of a map. So we're gonna wipe this clean and start with a blank slate of just the trackage and slowly go through the progression of how the different railroads popped up, where they popped up, and how railroads may have taken over one another or merged together to eventually create CSX. Now, before we go in, let me make two remarks about the info that's going to be placed on this screen. This is all made in reference to the trains.com map, and that map was made in 2003. So if there's some random small trackage that CSX may have sold off or something like that in the past 20 years, the map may not reflect that. Regardless, this general overview here will cover all the real information that you need to know, like all the significant lines that CSX still really uses. That'll be covered in this map, so you don't need to worry about that. And secondly, when I put a predecessor railroad on this map, let it be known that when it appears on the map, that is not how the railroad started. Because when they first started gaining prominence, they were the really key form of transportation for moving people and goods. So they grew after their initial charters. But for simplicity, when it pops up on the map, it's just going to be to the size that it really grew to at its peak, and the trackage that CSX actually uses to this day. Alright, with those two conditions out of the way, let's start with the history of CSX. Now, even the railroads that are often attributed to being the foundation of CSX came from other railroads, and those railroads came from other railroads. So if you really wanted to split it, you could probably get to hundreds of different railroads that eventually led to the creation of CSX. But I have neither the time or the economic compensation required to research or animate that onto a map. So we're going to set the beginning of CSX history in 1827 with the founding of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, followed by in 1833, the founding of the Georgia Railroad, and following in 1834, we had the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad being founded, and then in 1846, the Pennsylvania Railroad was founded. The Louisville and Nashville, or the L&N, whose commemoration we just saw on CSX 1850, was started in 1850, hence the number on the locomotive, followed by the Western Maryland Railroad in 1852, the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western in 1853, and the Atlanta and West Point in 1857. And before we go on, I'm going to stop and make a quick little note about the Atlanta and West Point here. So the Atlanta and West Point Railroad ran on the West Point route, and the route was actually owned by the Georgia Railroad, or more specifically, the Georgia Railroad and Banking Company, the corporate entity that owned the railroad, which is why, if you look at this image here, you'll notice that the Atlanta and West Point and the Georgia Railroad have almost exactly the same scheme, minus the actual name of the locomotive. And the West Point route actually consisted of two railroads that were both under the Georgia Railroad, and that would be the Atlanta and West Point Railroad and the Western Railway of Alabama. And the Western Railway of Alabama literally ran as its namesake. it ran the West Point routes on all the trackage that was west of West Point, Georgia. And the Atlanta and West Point Railroad really began as the Atlanta and LaGrange Railroad that was chartered in 1847 and over the course of 10 years had its trackage grow up to West Point, Georgia. And after it reached West Point, Georgia, they renamed the railroad to Atlanta and West Point, and thus we had the completion of the West Point route and the ANWP. So even though there are technically two railroads involved in the West Point route, the date you're seeing on the screen represents when the later of the two railroads actually made it to West Point, Georgia and effectively completed the route. Alright, with that out of the way, we have the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad that was founded in 1866, the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad founded in 1869, that'll be very important, the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad that was founded in 1872, the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railroad founded in 1873, Pittsburgh and Lake Erie founded in 1875, Chicago and Eastern Illinois founded in 1877, Charleston and Western Carolina 1896, Columbia, Newberry, and Lawrence 1896, the Monon Railroad in 1897, the Pierre Marquette in 1900, the Seaboard Airline and the Atlantic Coastline both being founded in 1900, and those will be very important. The Gainesville Midland, yep, that Gainesville Midland, that beloved line, originally being founded in 1904, the Durham and Southern Railroad being founded in 1906, the Virginia and Carolina Southern founded in 1907, the New York Central founded in 1914, the Piedmont and Northern founded in 1914, the Monongahela Railroad founded in 1915, so let me jump in real quick. The Monon and the Monongahela are two separate railroads. Yeah. The Monon is not a short form of the Monongahela. After that, we have the Reading Company founded in 1924.
Wait a minute!
Yep, that Reading. My Hall of Fame gatekeeping run continues. And in the same year, the Clinchfield Railroad was founded. And then, finally, we have the Atlanta, Birmingham, and Coast Railroad founded in 1926. That was a lot of info, and looking at the map, there are a lot of different railroads on it. Railroads that span all over the eastern part of the United States, and depending on their location, move different things and had different services that they provided. Even just solely looking at my home state of Georgia, there are almost 10 different railroads. And if we want to compare the map to where we've been filming trains today, we are technically here on ex-Seaboard Airline trackage. The modern CSX trackage is the CSX Abbeville subdivision that runs from Tucker, Georgia up to Abbeville, South Carolina, and passing through cities such as Lawrenceville and Athens. And even though today these CSX rails may be dominated by GEVOs and such, when these rails belonged to the SAL, the railroad looked a lot different, with steam being used on these lines before the eventual takeover of diesel, which would be used for freight services and the famed Silver Comet passenger service offered by the Seaboard Airline. And although on the surface, it may seem like you really wouldn't be able to tell what a given railroad operated, if we look at the layout of the trackage of some of these railroads, we get a clue as to what they moved, especially in the middle. Looking at the very center of the map, do you notice how the L&N and the Chesapeake and Ohio trackage appears to have clusters of tiny segments of track all clustered together in a small area? And that the Clinchfield Railroad trackage also terminates in that same area? Well, that's because these railroads were huge movers of coal. Yep, back when coal was the primary form of energy, railroads across the United States were finding it very profitable to move this commodity from mines to power plants. And in terms of CSX history, the L&N and the Chesapeake and Ohio were some of the biggest movers of coal in their heyday. Hence, all the small bits of trackage that are clustered around coal sources. And although this trackage being on CSX does mean that these lines technically are still owned by CSX, as you probably know, coal is not used nearly as much as it was in the previous century, which means that the primary business that a lot of these rail lines were built for no longer really exists. So if you do go to these lines, you may find yourself very disappointed to be presented with some of the most beautiful scenes that you could possibly find and to see no trains. I hate the James River sub, bro. Anyways, even though coal may not be nearly as popular as it was in the years past, you still do get as needed coal movements. It's not like the traffic has completely disappeared. And the lasting legacy of coal in CSX's history and present would be exemplified with this next train. In keeping with the spirit of the L&N Heritage Unit that we just saw, the next train would be a northbound coal train, CSX C904, coming out of Indiana and heading up to South Carolina. So, if we plot all these dates on the timeline, we can see that there are a lot of different railroads and routes that were operated independently all across the eastern part of the United States. But if you notice on the timeline, there was a lot of empty space. So, let's get to how these railroads merged together to form CSX. Now, this really began in 1922 when the Atlantic Coast Line leased the VNCS, and the Atlantic Coast Line, continuing its run of taking over smaller railroads, also took over the CN&L in 1924, which is why both the logo of the CN&L and all the locomotives have the same scheme, similar to the ACL. And then, the ACL also took over the Atlanta, Birmingham, and Coast in 1946. The following year, in 1947, the Chesapeake and Ohio fully incorporated the Pere Marquette, and then in 1957, the Louisville and Nashville fully incorporated the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railroad. 2 years later, the Atlantic Coast Line fully incorporated the CNWC, and then the Seaboard Airline took over my beloved Gainesville Midland route. And then 4 years later, the Chesapeake and Ohio acquired the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And according to the technical jargon, it was that the CNO was affiliated with the BNO, but really the end goal was for them to merge, but that can't just happen immediately. So corporately, the CNO took over the BNO. And maybe you're wondering, why are all these railroads merging in a way that we don't really see today? Well, in the beginning, it was just one railroad is bigger than the other, and it sort of benefits the smaller railroad to incorporate with the bigger railroad. And then the bigger railroad is also getting the profits from whatever service the smaller railroad was providing. But as we start getting into the 1950s and basically post-World War II era, there was a great shift that was happening in terms of the transportation world, and that was the mass use of cars. Cars were taking over as the preferred means of transportation for people due to the fact that they were cheaper, they were being mass-produced, and based on government aid such as the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, which basically invested billions of dollars into the construction of the highway system that we know today, to offer a more convenient and individual way for people to be able to move around the United States. At least theoretically. While this may seem all good and dandy, this presented a big problem for the railroads.
What do you mean by that?
See, the big difference between railroads of the past and railroads of today is that all the major railroads only run freight services now. But in the past, they ran both freight and passenger service. And because cars were becoming more popular and roads were expanding, railroads were all of a sudden starting to lose a lot of business to automobiles, and it started becoming cost inefficient to, one, have passenger service in the first place, and two, for the railroad to even run as a whole. So smaller railroads that really didn't have too much of a chance would be getting bought out by bigger railroads, and then bigger railroads would be combining with each other to try to join themselves and combine their economic prowess to keep each other afloat. And this would especially start becoming prevalent in the 1960s, because in 1967, the Seaboard Airline and the Atlantic Coast Line merged to form the Seaboard Coast Line, to form a huge railroad superpower in the Southeast. Simultaneously, there was a merger going up in the Northeast. The Pennsylvania Railroad, the New York Central, and the New Haven Railroad were all seeing economic hits due to the lack of passenger service from the expanded use of cars. Because especially up in the Northeast, where communities are a lot more dense, passenger service was a bigger part of the operations. And so, in an attempt to keep all these railroads afloat, the Penn Central was formed by the merger of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the New York Central, and the New Haven Railroad. And there were concerns that even before the Penn Central officially formed, that administrative issues would lead to its downfall. But I'm sure all of those concerns were just exaggerations.
One of the greatest railroads in history. 50 years of great railroading. The Penn Central, baby. You can count on us.
He's a liar!
This railroad is recognized as one of the worst railroads to have existed in recent history. When they weren't running onto the highway, they had 10-mile-per-hour speed restrictions on some parts of the system because the tracks were so horribly maintained. And they were somehow losing trains, which boggles my mind. How do you lose a whole train? Anyways, besides the Penn Central, we'll get back to them later. Another merger formed in the Northeast when the Erie Railroad and the Delaware-Lackawanna Railroads merged to form the Erie-Lackawanna Railroad in 1968. Going back to the Southeast, with the SCL being one of the major railroad superpowers and smaller railroads struggling to find business, the SCL was gradually incorporating these smaller railroads into their system. And this would be seen in 1969 when they incorporated the Piedmont and Northern. Going back western, in the same year, the L&M bought former Chicago and Eastern Illinois trackage from Mopac because the Chicago and Eastern Illinois Railroad had actually been taken over by the Missouri Pacific or the Mopac Railroad in 1967, and then 2 years later, L&M bought trackage from Mopac that was formerly Chicago and Eastern Illinois territory. And the L&N, similar to the SCL, was also doing their own form of taking over smaller railroads because 2 years after they acquired the CNEI trackage, they would acquire the Monon Railroad in 1971. So looking on our map right now, we can see that there were three major powers, at least in terms of trackage that actually belongs to CSX today. And that is the Louisville and Nashville, the Seaboard Coastline, and the Chesapeake and Ohio. Now, the railroads at this time were still experiencing economic hits because the expansion of the roadways was taking away passenger service in the form of mass use of automobiles, and was also taking away freight service because trucks were starting to be used on the highways, which introduced competition for the existing railroads. And with this loss of freight traffic, some of the infrastructure that lied along these railroads no longer had the profitability it had in the past. It started seeing the doors get shut. And we can see an example of this back in Lawrenceville, Georgia, with the historic train depot that we started our journey at today. As I mentioned before, this is former Seaboard Airline trackage, and this depot was built by the SCL in 1914. And looking online, you can find images of steam trains stopping their manifests here to either collect or drop off goods before continuing on their journey. And although information is very limited on the depth of the operations at this depot, assumably there was some drop in freight service, either due maybe to the expansion of the roads or just simply customers in the area leaving, and the depot got abandoned. Before eventually, the city of Lawrenceville took over, and now it's a little landmark of this North Georgia city, and is even the name of the shopping district that we are currently in. Regardless of that, back to the history. Railroads wanted to keep their autonomy while also merging the corporate strengths to keep each other afloat. So, in 1972, the family line system was formed by the alliance of the Seaboard Coastline, the L&N, the Clinchfield, the Georgia Railroad, and consequently the West Point route because that was under the Georgia Railroad. Now, let it be known that the family lines was not actually its own railroad. It was really a marketing term of the corporate alliance of these 5 railroads respectively. It wasn't like the family lines railroad took over the L&N and the SCL and all that. All of these railroads were corporately working together as one entity while still maintaining their independence. Despite the alliance, there was still a level of hierarchy within the family lines. For example, as I mentioned before, the West Point route was under the Georgia Railroad, and in fact, the Louisville and Nashville was actually a subsidiary of the Seaboard Coastline during this time. But since all of these railroads were still running during this time, to make things simpler, we're not going to include that in here, and we're just going to say they were all allied. Power of friendship type E. And as part of this alliance, all the railroads that were included within it all got a new paint scheme. But in addition to the new scheme, they were also marked with the original railroad's reporting mark somewhere on the locomotive to signify that the original railroad was still in operation, which is why you may see family lines locomotives that have SCL or LNN on them. And this trend of corporate alliances would continue because just the next year, in 1973, the Chessie system was formed, when the Chesapeake and Ohio, the Baltimore and Ohio, and the Western Maryland railroads formed their own corporate alliance. And since the Chesapeake and Ohio was the biggest of all the railroads inside this alliance, the system was branded as the Chessie system. And the Chessie system would be how that Rock Island trackage that's in the top left corner of the map eventually got incorporated into CSX because the Rock Island wasn't doing too good and the Chessie was able to buy out some of the trackage. Anyways, while this was going on, let's turn our attention back to the Northeast, where the railroads are struggling. All the other trends of roads expanding and automobiles being used and trucks expanding were all already hurting the railroads, and the combined incompetence and horrible service of the Penn Central was not helping at all.
You serve zero purpose.
And the Erie Lackawanna and similar other railroads in this region were not having a good time right now. And so to save the potentially profitable lines of these bankrupt rail carriers, the government had to step in, and thus we had the Consolidated Rail Corporation, or Conrail, formed in 1976. Now, when Conrail formed, it did not take over all of these railroads at once, but for simplification, I'm just going to merge all the different railroads that Conrail did eventually take over with its foundation date. So in terms of railroads on the map, the ones that just disappeared are the Monongahela, the Penn Central, the Erie Lackawanna, the Reading, and then whatever shared trackage was between the Erie Lackawanna, the Penn Central, and the Lehigh Valley that has some history that, like I said, I knew at the time or economic compensation required to investigate. Returning back south with the family line system here, the Seaboard Coastline, which is already big enough even before the corporate alliance, was still doing its part in taking over the smaller railroads that were on the cusp of going out of business. Because in 1979, they took over the Durham and Southern Railroad. And this would be the last of the takeovers, at least on this timeline, before we eventually get to 1980, where the CSX Corporation was formed with the mergers of the Chessie and SCL Industries.
Over there.
Now, let me explain what's going on here because I was very confused by this. So you remember how I said how the family lines was like the corporate alliance between the SCL and the LNN and all the other railroads that were involved?
Nope.
Well, if you forgot, I'm telling you right now.
Thank you.
Although this alliance may have been marketed as the family lines, this was not actually the corporate entity. The corporate entity was titled SCL Industries, which was a holding company. A holding company being a parent company, usually a corporation, whose purpose is to buy and control the ownership interests of other companies. So even though the family line system may have been known as the family lines, the actual corporate entity was SCL Industries. That's the holding company that represents the business of the family lines. Pretty confusing researching this because SCL Industries has the name of one of the railroads that's included inside the... Anyways, SCL Industries merged with the Chessie system, the holding company whose name conveniently actually matches the market name of the system, and this formed the CSX Corporation. Note, this does not say the CSX Railroad, because all these other subsidiaries, all the other railroads that are within these holding companies, still existed. but at the same time, the corporation itself was getting formed. So it's like you have two big holding companies, they each have their own railroads, and these two big holding companies are now merging together to form an even bigger corporate entity that includes all these subsidiary railroads. Before CSX Railroad would form, however, these subsidiaries needed to merge. So if we go back to the family lines, before it was the 5 independent railroads that were under the corporate entity of the SCL Industries and the market name the family lines, but it wasn't actually one railroad. However, in 1982, that changed because all of the railroads within the family lines officially merged to form the Seaboard system. So in terms of the family line side, the railroad merger part of that aspect has been complete. On the chassis system, however, in 1987, the Western Maryland officially merged with the Baltimore and Ohio, and then the Baltimore and Ohio officially merged with the Chesapeake and Ohio. So even though the chassis system still existed in 1987, there was only one railroad actually left, and that was the Chesapeake and Ohio. And so in 1987, the Chesapeake and Ohio and the Seaboard system officially merged to form the CSX Railroad. The CSX Railroad that we know today.
Incredible.
The C standing for Chessie, the S standing for Seaboard, and the X, well, that depends on who you ask. The most common thing I've heard is that the X stands for a multiplication symbol, essentially saying that the potential of CSX as one company is greater than what the sum of the companies that made up CSX could achieve on their own. So that's what we're going to go with. Regardless, the creation of CSX created one of the largest railroads on the eastern side of the United States, spanning states covering almost the entirety of the eastern coast and forming a huge railroad entity whose capacity would only be rivaled by Norfolk Southern. CSX's size wouldn't stop here because there were still a bunch of smaller railroads that had escaped all the other mergers that most other railroads had seen in the 1900s. But now with the formation of CSX, there was no way that these railroads could compete, and CSX saw profit in all of these. So in 1991, CSX fully incorporated the RF&P Railroad, and then in 1993, they fully incorporated the PNLE Railroad. So if we exclude all the railroads that would eventually go to Norfolk Southern, CSX has basically taken over the East Coast, but there was still one more very profitable railroad entity of the eastern United States, and that was Conrail. Especially with the rise of intermodal traffic that has started becoming really popular in the late 1900s, Conrail was doing great, and CSX wanted some of that profit. So CSX was actually looking to buy out Conrail, but of course, Norfolk Southern was like,
Oh, brother, whoa, now. You got too much dip on your chip.
no, we're not about to let you just buy out this company and become this superpower on the East that we have to compete with. So there was plenty of corporate back and forth that was going on before eventually they reached a settlement, and in 1999, Conrail was officially dissolved, with 58% of its assets going to Norfolk Southern and 42% of their assets going to CSX. So this is why there is both a Norfolk Southern Conrail Heritage Unit and a CSX Conrail Heritage Unit. So CSX technically got the short end of the stick here, but they did still gain a bunch of railroad trackage and lots of power that would eventually be repainted into CSX livery and be dubbed as XCR locomotives by foamers for decades to come. And now you may be thinking, this map looks pretty complete. You know, we've kind of taken over all the trackage that we had in the beginning, and now we just have CSX. However, I mentioned that this map was made in 2003, and although the majority of the CSX trackage is encapsulated in this map, there is one more key purchase that happened rather recently that we got to discuss, and that is CSX's acquisition of Pan Am Railways. Pan Am Railways operates strictly in the Northeast, starting off with some traffic in New York and going all the way up through Maine. And just like all railroads up to this point in history, it has a lot of history from predecessor railroads. It really began in 1981 with the Guilford Transportation Industries Incorporated being founded, whose railroad part was known as the Guilford Railway System. And this was founded basically as like a private Northeast version of Conrail, a corporate entity just to buy out failing railroads that had been struggling at the time. And they got right to work in doing just that. First purchasing the Maine Central, then the Portland Terminal Company, then the Boston and Maine Railroad, then the Delaware and Hudson Railroad, before declaring the Delaware and Hudson bankrupt in 1988. And all these railroads that were involved in the Guilford Railway System were still technically operating at the time, but they were all under the GTI Corporation. So similar to the Chessie system, you have one main paint scheme to represent the Guilford Railway System, but you still have the reporting markings of the original railroads to represent that these individual railroads were still in operation, but were corporately under one entity. 10 years after the Delaware and Hudson debacle, GTI Incorporated bought the logo of the Pan American World Airways, which was an airline that had gone bankrupt in 1991, and GTI literally just bought the logo with the name and made it their own, which eventually led to the corporation being rebranded as the Pan Am Systems, and then 8 years later, the railroad got officially made Pan Am Railways. So going back to our main map, we have all the CSX trackage that has been incorporated up to this point in history, And we also have Pan Am now in the picture. And Pan Am comes into the picture because it was put up for sale up in 2020. And CSX wanted to buy it, and just like with Conrail, Norfolk Southern was like, but this time, CSX would actually win the battle. And in 2020, CSX fully purchased Pan Am Railways, and now, with that being included, we have the CSX Railway that we know today.
Sensational.
As you could tell, there are a lot of railroads, a lot of business, and a lot of economics behind how CSX eventually came to be, with different competitors completely outside the railroad and lots of takeovers and mergers within the railroad to eventually lead to one giant corporation to serve customers all across the eastern United States. And even though some history may be lost, the legacy of the railroads that led up to the creation of CSX still exists through memorabilia such as the depot here, heritage units that are running all over the CSX system, and the trains themselves that still run, pulling some of the same goods that they pulled over 100 years ago. Just like this next train here, yet another coal train, CSX C772. This one coming out of Kentucky and heading up to North Carolina. Well, there you have it, my friends. That is, to the best of my ability, my explanation on the full history of the CSX Railroad, reaching all the way back to 1827 and still living today in 2024. If there's any important information that you think I missed or any other random tidbit of info that you know, feel free to share it down below. I definitely learned a lot through this, and I hope you learned a lot too, because bro, I cannot believe how long this video took. I hope that you guys enjoyed, and until next time, my friends, God bless. I will see you soon out on the high iron.